when people look at you and they don't see you, they look past you.
It's about believing that something should be different and having the courage to live in that transition zone.
We contain multitudes.
Why did I feel so awful so much of the time?
It is a place that is so steeped in like white patriarchy, and yet I never felt more myself and more among Black people.
The women's rooms, they were basically men's rooms, and the urinals were still in there.
I feel like I spent so much time trying to educate the Amherst College community that I didn't get enough time to just be a student.
This is Black Women of Amherst College, a storytelling project exploring the experiences and impact of Black women in elite higher education. I'm Nichelle Carr, Amherst College, class of 1998. I want to start off by telling you a story about a Black woman who is neither a student nor a professor at Amherst College. Her name is Anna Julia Cooper, and in the early 1900s, she found herself in the middle of a raging debate between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Du Bois and Washington were in an intense feud about the future of Black education.
On the one hand, Booker T. Washington believed that education was a practical means to an end. It was about getting a job, having an income. The idea was rooted in economic self-sufficiency.
This is Matthew Alexander Randolph, Amherst class of 2016. He's currently a PhD candidate at Stanford, and he's written on this debate between Washington and Du Bois.
On the other hand, Du Bois had a much more radical vision for education. Education was important for its own sake. The idea of intellectual attainment was critical for political progress.
In some ways, the Du Bois argument was more controversial.
It was very revolutionary and radical to believe that African-American education should be more than just reading and writing, learning the bare bones to contribute to a profession, but actually was a means for creating a change in society.
This question, how best to educate Black students, gets right at the heart of what it means to obtain power in American society. Education is a pathway to greater freedom, but what kind of education? As a pioneering intellectual herself, it's not like Anna Julia Cooper was a peripheral figure in this debate between Du Bois and Washington. She had an important role to play because from 1901 to 1906, she was the principal of M Street High School, later to be renamed Paul Laurence Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C.
Dunbar was a Black public school in segregated Washington, D.C., essentially the crown jewel in the D.C. public school system.
In a deeply segregated and prejudiced society, Dunbar High School was a true rarity. It aspired to compete with elite prep schools like Exeter and Andover. So Dunbar is where this debate between Washington and Du Bois would be put into action. And Anna Julia Cooper decided that Dunbar's curriculum should reflect Du Boisian values. She prepared her students for a liberal arts education, and in doing so, she ensured that they would be indisputably the equals of their white counterparts.
Cooper insisted on a liberal arts curriculum that was meaningful not just for students to live a life of the mind, but actually prepared them for the admissions requirements of Northern universities.
In order to be admitted to elite Northeastern colleges and universities like Amherst, you needed to study Greek, Latin, classics, and philosophy. And by installing this Du Boisian-style curriculum, she helped create a pipeline between her all-Black high school and elite colleges. Without this liberal arts foundation, the pipeline to these colleges wouldn't have been possible. Actually, Anna Julia Cooper was making the argument for a liberal arts education before W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1891, she wrote an essay, Higher Education of Women, which argued for the benefits of Black women being trained in classical literature. This was years before Du Bois wrote his essay of the training of Black men. Anna Julia Cooper's life is almost too incredible to comprehend. She was born a slave, and she never knew who her father was, only that he was a slave owner. At 9 years old, she received a scholarship from a school whose mission was to educate the formerly enslaved and their families. Anna Julia Cooper would go on to Oberlin College, before eventually becoming principal at Dunbar. But her emphasis on a liberal arts curriculum at Dunbar was controversial.
To insist on a liberal arts education, for us, might not seem totally radical, but at the time, it was something that was unheard of in Washington, D.C., and she had to step down because of how radical and how far she was going with her ideas.
After Dunbar, Anna Julia Cooper would go on to get a PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris. She was one of the first Black women in America to earn a doctorate. Now, here's the thing. I'd never heard of Anna Julia Cooper. I had heard of some of the extraordinary Black men who came to Amherst from Dunbar High School and helped change the world, Charles Hamilton Houston and William Hastie, to mention only two, but never of the woman who made their educations possible. When I started this project, I wanted to uncover unknown stories of Black women who had an impact at Amherst before coeducation. I knew these stories must exist. To be honest, I was expecting at best to find a maid, a servant, or even a slave. But who I found is Anna Julia Cooper, who we affectionately call AJC. And as her story shows, there is a hidden history.
I think what's so essential about the Dunbar story and about the story of Anna Julia Cooper is that Black women have often been in the shadows of Amherst College history.
And that is exactly what this podcast is all about. This podcast series is a collaboration with Amherst. It was originally inspired by Professor Mavis Campbell's 1999 book, Black Women of Amherst College. Professor Campbell's work focused specifically on the Black women students of Amherst. But in this podcast, we are expanding the scope to include more of the Black women who have contributed to the Amherst College we know today. Women like Anna Julia Cooper. But this podcast is not just about Amherst College. This story is about the United States of America and about Black women's place both in America and the larger world. This is about the work that's often unseen and unknown that Black women have had to do and continue to do to reshape powerful institutions across society. Amherst is a microcosm. The histories of Amherst, like many of those of this country, are incomplete and for that reason, inaccurate. So we want to set the record straight and tell the stories of Black women at Amherst by having them describe their experiences in their own words. Now, in order to understand the challenges they faced and the differences they made, we need to take a step back. Up until the mid-1970s, Amherst was an all-male school, so it was only recently that Black women had a significant presence on campus. And in order to understand the history of Black women at Amherst, you do have to know something about the Black history of Amherst. So let's set the scene. Amherst College is very literally a college on a hill. It is the picturesque quintessence of a New England college. The college began as a seminary for indigent young men. The first class graduated in 1825, and the very next year, Amherst graduated its first Black student, Edward Jones. Now, Edward Jones is actually an example of where prevailing histories can leave out an essential part of the story. In the 1820s, folks who considered themselves anti-slavery were certainly not pro-equality. Black Americans like Edward Jones were born and raised in the U.S., yet many white Americans thought that the best thing to do would be to send them back to Africa. Edward Jones's admission to Amherst and his graduation were conditioned on him also going back to Africa as a missionary. So while Amherst can rightfully claim an early Black graduate, it cannot claim to have been free from the racist assumptions and practices that were rampant at the time. For most of the 19th century, Amherst was not the elite college that many perceive it to be today. It wasn't until the Gilded Age that Amherst College started to become home to students from the most powerful families in America. Bob Howard, class of 1976, is a writer who has researched the history of Amherst College.
So Amherst was becoming this very wealthy kind of institution, national institution of the elite, at a time when the society was going through enormous social conflict, labor conflict, racial conflict, mass immigration, and then the nativist reaction against it. It's not so different from today, frankly.
It's important to give credit where credit is due. And if you dig into the history, you can find genuine instances of Amherst taking significant steps in terms of diversity and inclusion. One of the best examples happened during the tenure of Alexander Meiklejohn, who was Amherst College president from 1912 to 1924.
Meiklejohn was a guy who was very interested in attracting, let's say, unrepresented groups. And there are amazing stories about how he kind of insisted that Black students be able to join athletic teams. There's a story of how a football team was playing at Princeton, and the coach writes saying, I can't guarantee the safety of the Black members of the Amherst football team. Right. Meiklejohn writes back saying, fine, then we're not going to come. This was a time when at Harvard, there were stringent limits on the number of Black students. They were segregated in the dorms. So even though, there was certainly racism at Amherst at that time, the fraternities, for example, were segregated. He says, we must open the place to them, and if they don't come, we have to go out and get them. We have to bring them in. And he talked about this kind of growing number of Black students as a sort of he calls it a fortunate trend.
Still, even though Amherst was slightly ahead of the curve in admitting Black students, for the most part, it was still just a trickle.
It wasn't until 1960 that we actually had more than 10 Black students in a single class.
This is Martin Garner, the director of the library at Amherst College.
I think should show you that having 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 doesn't really change the culture. It doesn't change how the college sees itself. And I think if you are talking about kind of the textbook definition of token, you could point to that.
By the 1960s, the school had begun to recruit Black students in decent, yet still relatively small numbers. But the big changes start in 1974, when the trustees vote in favor of Amherst College going co-ed. So co-education at Amherst College comes as a result and as a culmination of a lot of seismic shifts that have been happening in American society up to that point.
I was sitting there demanding a God-given right.
You had the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
This brother here, myself, all of us were born with our hair like this.
Followed by the women's movement and the movement for lesbian and gay rights in the 1970s. And of course, anti-war protests against involvement in Vietnam.
Until we have ended the war in Vietnam and the neo-colonialism in Africa.
So the world was changing at an accelerating pace within American society. And folks who have been forced to accept things as they were absolutely refused to do so any longer. And so Amherst College, like a lot of colleges, finally made the decision to go co-ed. In the fall of 1975, 95 women arrive on campus, 6% of the student body. This is when Black women students are suddenly a visible presence on the Amherst campus.
When I called Amherst, I said, listen, I'm interested in being a member of this first class.
This is Cheryl Black Blair, class of 1978. She was a transfer student and one of the very first women to matriculate at Amherst.
Oh, we already have all of our women. I said, oh, really? And then something in my mind said, ask how many Black women there are. So I asked, how many African-American women do you have in this class? Oops, let's put you on hold. So they quickly put me on hold. Yeah. And they're like, okay, we got to have a hot one on this line. She's got all the credentials. She's perfect. Let's take her.
Now I want to introduce you to the Honorable Denise Francois. She's from the class of 1980, the first full class of freshman women who started at Amherst College.
I had an English teacher, John McMichaels. He had graduated from Amherst, and he was my English teacher. And he had said, the school's going co-ed, you should apply. I did feel like a trailblazer. They had to make all these changes to accommodate women. The dorms were going co-ed. That was a big deal. It shocked my mother because she's like, why is that boy in the bedroom? And I'm like, Mom, it's co-ed. And she seemed to think I hadn't really told her about that.
And so here we are. Amherst College has done the right thing. It has moved with the times. It has admitted women as students. In the entering class of 1976, there were a total of 1,491 students, of which 19% were women and 1.7% were Black women. Amherst College had not gotten around to doing a whole lot more to prepare the space for women. These women really had to carve out a space for themselves in this place that was very literally not built for them.
A lot of the trustees were not supportive of it, and there were changes that were not made.
Leanne Shelton, class of 1980.
I was in a dormitory. In the women's rooms, they were basically men's rooms, and the urinals were still in there. So we put flower pots in the urinals because they wouldn't take them out. And we didn't get equal time in the gym. I was on a squash team, and we got these terrible practice times, like in the middle of the day during lunch, basically. And I said, why do we have to practice during lunch? Why can't we get after classes? And I was told, well, the trustees don't want the women there, and to make it priority, and you're just it'll take a little while, time for things to sort of become fully co-ed. And I just said, look, I'm only here for 4 years. My money is just as good as the next guy. I'm not waiting. So you need to make it happen now.
So Leanne Shelton told us about one of her classmates from the class of 1980, Sheila Maddox, who told us the story of her arrival at Amherst College. And what I love is how much it shows that the Black men students of Amherst College were preparing themselves for the arrival of these young Black women.
I remember when my parents dropped me off and we had to unload the car. All the guys were there to unload. And, it's the time that you break with your parents. And my sister was there, of course. She probably spent as much time on campus as I did after I matriculated. And Steve Coleman.
Steve Coleman, class of 1978.
Helped. And when it was time to go and I was getting ready to just get crazy about separating, he just grabbed me and pulled me. And I met Leanne Shelton, who would end up being my best buddy all the way through.
I think there's this idea that women came to the college and it's like, scratch the needle off the record. Everything stops. It's 1976 and women have arrived. And what we're going to hear is that it landed more with a whimper than with a bang.
It was as if you showed up and everybody was doing their routine and doing their sports and having their frat parties.
Denise Francois.
Hanging out with the groups that continued on from high school or your city or area of the East Coast you would come from. It's hard to explain. It's difficult to articulate. I to a large extent, I think I just kept my head down and went about my business. When people look at you and they don't see you, they look past you. I felt sometimes it was professors, and not just at Amherst. They don't know what to do with this Black woman or this Black person or other students. They look through you. And so I guess it's easier for them to not see me or see someone else that's not like them.
So both the faculty and other students just didn't know how to respond or deal with a Black woman.
Absolutely. And to a certain extent, they didn't know what to do with women, let alone a Black woman, because this is a school that had been historically all male. For a lot of women, it was a culture shock. And I learned later a large group of women dropped out the first year.
I'm Adrienne White-Faines. I'm in the class of 1982 of Amherst College.
Adrienne White-Faines is not only one of the first women at Amherst, but she also has really deep multi-generational connections to the college.
I had visited Amherst because my brother graduated from there. It was an all-male school, and while he was there in his last year, they announced that they were going to go co-ed. I was really intrigued by the thought of being in one of the first classes of women, and it felt like a safe space to go be bold.
She had grown up seeing the college from afar through the experiences of the male members of her family. And so this was the first time that she would get to experience it for herself.
My grandfather went to Amherst, and he didn't want me to go. He didn't believe that Amherst was supposed to be for women. It was an all-male school. He was very proud of it being an all-male school. He was grateful to Amherst and very loyal to Amherst. Charles Drew was there when he was there.
I just want to take a minute here because Adrienne is talking about Dr. Charles Drew, Amherst College, class of 1926. The Black Cultural Theme House at Amherst is named after him. Charles Drew House used to be the Phi Kappa Psi frat house, but in the 1940s, when this fraternity decided to admit a Black member despite national fraternity rules, it lost its national charter. The house later became the Black Cultural House, and as a result of the work of Amina Merritt, a Black woman from the class of 1980, the house was renamed for Charles Drew. To this day, Drew House is the center of Black student life at Amherst. Okay, back to Adrienne and her grandfather.
He had a full history where he had come out of Dunbar High School in D.C., and he was one of the early Black men to go to Amherst. He was very loyal, very prideful about how Amherst changed his life, but he absolutely was not encouraging me. He was very proud that my brother was able to go. And of course, the number of Black women was very small. I was coming in with this very strong awareness, growing awareness of who I was as a Black woman, and just really excited to get out of this environment where I didn't appreciate who I was. And I was looking forward to being welcomed and being able to just exist in a more global forum at Amherst. But I was doing a lot of navigating, both how do I break in, just normal things that everybody goes through when they go to college. But it didn't take long. And the sisters, because there were so few women, the women were a ratio of 1 to 10. And so there would be like one floor of women and 3 to 4 floors of men. And so it wasn't hard to start to find that the women got close and then the Black women got even closer. And so that started very early. And so I'm appreciative, honestly, of being in that transition phase because it made relationships in a really profound way. I joined the Amherst Women's Center, and that's where we had problems. We just clashed and clashed and clashed because it was this pick your sides, women over men, and the conflict to have to distinguish, am I a woman first or am I a Black person first? And where are my loyalties or allegiances? It became very quickly evident to me that people needed to understand I am a Black woman first. I will stand with my community and my family because the issues are very, very different. And I didn't trust that the Women's Center had my full agenda at heart. And I was like, don't pit me to go against, because I'm going with my folks. I'm choosing my family.
This gets at the heart of Black women and intersectionality. I've literally had conversations with well-meaning white women who ask, can we just put the race thing to the side for a second? And the answer is no, never. As Black women, we can never put aside the fact that we are constantly subject to multiple social classifications, specifically race and gender. And while the term intersectionality was coined by the Black woman law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, the fact of intersectionality affects many of us across identities throughout society. These multiple classifications create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage. And this leads us to one of the big questions driving this whole project. Can an institution like Amherst truly achieve both diversity and inclusion? I want to introduce you to Dr. Kim Leary, a member of one of the earliest classes of women graduates from Amherst and a current trustee of Amherst College.
I'm Kim Leary, class of 1982, currently serve as a senior vice president at the Urban Institute, and I'm also on the faculty of Harvard Medical School, the Harvard School of Public Health, and also the Harvard Kennedy School.
Kim has spent the last 15 years working in public policy with a focus on improving the life outcomes of women and girls of color.
I've had a particular interest in women and girls of color from my work in the Obama administration, working with the Council on Women and Girls, and then more recently in work I was privileged to do in support of President Biden's executive order on advancing equity in federal agencies.
Kim says that Black women and girls carry a unique burden of finding themselves simultaneously invisible and hypervisible in the world.
My own personal experience, and I imagine yours, there's a way in which we may be physically visible in the environment in the classroom if there are just a few of us, but we may be invisible in terms of having a sense of a voice that counts. We may be called upon in class, but not necessarily always be sitting around the tables where decisions are made or where plans are produced. It's confusing to be both. So if you have a conversation that's just about invisibility, you're not capturing the emotional experience of Black women at Amherst or at Princeton or at so many places around the country. And if you are just talking about hypervisibility, then you're missing how silencing sometimes those spaces can be. So I think in order for us to really capture the full psychology of Black women, we have to be aware that they're experiencing multiple and sometimes confusing experiences of self in places like Amherst and other institutions of higher learning. So Amherst was not designed for Black women. It wasn't designed for women. It wasn't designed for most people.
So these kinds of conditions, are they inherent to places like this? And I don't mean inherent as in unfixable, but inherent as in part of the DNA of institutions.
For change to take place, you don't need to swap out all of your DNA, right? I'm not a biologist, but I remember enough of it to know that we conserve most of our DNA through the process of evolution and change. But those features of DNA that we are able to, that allow us to innovate, can be relatively small and discrete, but can make for big and important changes.
In the next episode, we're going to do a deeper dive into Black intellectual thought and meet a trailblazing Black woman at Amherst, the first Black woman professor at Amherst College, Sonia Sanchez. Let's end this episode by hearing her poem, A Black Woman Speaks, in its entirety.
'Cause as a Black woman, I am deep Black soil. They have tried to pollute me with a poison called America. They have tried to scorch my roots with dope. They have tried to drown my dreams with alcohol, with too many men who spit their foam on top of my fruit till it drops rotten in America's parks. But I am deep blue Black soil, and you can hear the sound of my walking as I bring forth green songs from a seasoned breast, as I burn on our evening bed of revolution. I, being Black woman, know only the way of the womb, for I am deep, 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 deep red soil for our emerging Black nation. And so, as I say again, and I probably can't say too often, that we do be about that, because in the past we've been other things. In the past, Black women, Black children, Black people in general have not, as I say to you again, loved themselves. Black women especially have been many things in this country, and quite often when I talk to people, I always tell young sisters that you have to be more than your mamas was. You have to be more than people think you be. You have to be, because in the past, we have been this. We are songs yet unsung. We are music yet unplayed. We be Black women, yeah, 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 singing in the night. We be lovers yet unloved. We be wives yet unwed. We be Black women, yeah, 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 singing in the night. We be books yet unread. We be words yet unspoken. We be black women, yeah, 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 singing in the night. We be flowers yet ungrown. We be perfume yet unsmelled. We be black women, yeah, 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 singing in the night. But if we begin to deal with ourselves, we be yesterday's red skies. We be tomorrow's green morning. We be black women, yeah, yeah, moving in the sun, 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 yeah.
Thanks for listening to Black Women of Amherst College. This series is a production of Amherst College, WC1 Studios, and Zell Division. I'm Nichelle Carr, executive producer and host. It was edited by Michael Osborne and produced by Jennifer Hsu and Tricia Nelson. Our engineers were Erica Huang and Evan Viola. Special thanks to all the women and other members of the Amherst College community who participated in and supported the project, including all of our storyteller interviewees, Tanae Adaro-Howard, President Biddy Martin, Mike Kelly, and the project's steering committee, Rhonda Cobham-Sander, Barton Garner, Sandy Janelius, Carrie Polk, Kate Salop, Beth Schumacher, Victoria Wilson, and Norm Jones. This series is dedicated to all of the Black women of Amherst College, past, present, and future.